Hi guys. So I'm recording this from my home. I have 2 dogs and 3 kids, so it'll be interesting. But anyway, we're going to pick up where we left off in the memory chapter. So I believe this was the last slide we looked at. So now we are going to move on and talk about long-term memory. Um, Actually, I think we covered this slide, but this is just reminding you of some different ways you can do, different things you can do to improve your memory. So we talked about overlearning, that even after you think you know something, you should still study it more. We talked about how if you have a test on Friday and you're going to study 5 hours, that it's better to study an hour a day instead of studying it all the night before. We've been doing testing and practicing retrieval, the quizzes. I've encouraged you to make yourself quizzes when you're looking at the PowerPoints. And then LT stands for long term. So long term verbal information is stored semantically. So if you hear something or read something, you're going to tend to remember that in terms of its meaning as opposed to the exact words. But if you see something visually that you're trying to remember, a scene, for instance, you will tend to store that as a visual image. Another interesting concept that relates to memory is schemas. So a schema is a cognitive structure in long-term memory, and it helps us to perceive, organize, process, and use information. So it kind of gives us a framework to think about something and then later to remember something. So here's a couple examples. Let's say you go to a different town and you go in a grocery store. You are going to kind of know what to do, even though you've never been there before. You know that you walk in, you get your cart, you go around and you get your items, and then you pay at the end, okay? So that schema helps you figure out what to do in a new situation. That was my dog, Aaron. He's very loud. Okay, the next example of schema is a Helen Keller story. This was in your chapter on page 264. So students were read a story, and it was about an unruly girl. Now, half of the participants, after they read the story, were told, hey, that was Helen Keller, and the other half were not. Later, when they were asked to remember the story, the students that were told this was about Helen Keller remembered that they had read that she was deaf, dumb, and blind, when actually they'd never read that. So a schema just helps us kind of put things into a framework so that we have a bit easier time remembering in the future, but it can also lead to errors. So I'll come back to that later. All right, let's talk about how long-term memory is organized. So you've got explicit memory, which is also called declarative. And then you've got implicit memory, which is also called procedural. So explicit memory is you remember facts and events, kind of anything that you are consciously aware of and can describe to someone else is explicit memory. Implicit memory is kind of task or skill memory. Sometimes it's called muscle memory. So this is when we remember things, but we might have a hard time describing it to someone else. And in fact, we might not even be aware of our memory for this thing. So if you learned a skill and then later were asked to perform it, that would be procedural or implicit. So we'll come back to that more later, but let's just go back to declarative. This is divided into two types, semantic memory and episodic memory. Now, semantic memory is just kind of general facts about the world, knowing who the President of the United States is, knowing what date it is, what's going on in the world. Episodic is personal memory. So remembering what you had for dinner last night, remembering a family occasion, okay? And what's really interesting is that a lot of times people with memory problems like amnesia, they can acquire semantic memories, but they don't have very good episodic memories. So they seem to kind of learn things over time, even though they don't remember the circumstances under which they learned those things. So let's give you a concrete example. There's a famous case study in psychology, a guy named H.M. And actually, he died a few years ago, so we know his name. His name is Henry Molaison. And what happened is he had very severe epilepsy. And he had multiple seizures a day. He had a tough time just living kind of a normal life. So they decided to do kind of a radical surgery. So they removed the medial portions of both of his temporal lobes. So medial is inside, lateral is outside. So they took out parts of his temporal lobes, and when they took this out, it also included the hippocampus and the amygdala and some of the surrounding cortex on both sides. Now, at the time, they thought that memory was kind of equally distributed in the brain. They didn't think there were certain areas of the brain that stored certain memories. So what happened is, after the surgery, even though it, oh my gosh, even though it was successful in terms of the epilepsy, it stopped his seizures. But a really bad side effect was that he had severe anterograde amnesia. And what that just means is that he couldn't remember any new information. So, like, for instance, his parents moved after the surgery, and he never learned where they moved to. He only remembered where they had lived before. So he couldn't lay down new memories. So after this case, we learned that the hippocampus and some of the surrounding structures are really important for explicit recollection of newly acquired information. He could not learn new information. But there was a type of memory that actually this wasn't true for. So the exception here was that this procedural or implicit memory was actually okay. The hippocampus, we now know, is really important for spatial memory. But there are probably some other types of memory as well. So let's talk about what he could do. So he was given a star, an outline of a star, and he was told to take his pencil and try to stay in that outline. Well, the catch was there was a mirror, and he couldn't just look down at the star. He had to look into a mirror to fill in this star. And I don't know if you've ever looked into a mirror and then tried to draw something. Everything is flipped and it's really hard. Well, so HM was given this task like 3 days in a row. So the second day they said, hey, Jim, have you ever done this before? And he said, nope, never seen it. But he did pretty well. The third day they said, hey, Jim, have you ever seen this before? He had no memory, but he did it almost perfectly. So he had learned this skill over the course of a few days. And even though he didn't have a conscious recollection of this skill, he had some kind of memory for this, muscle memory, if you will, stored somewhere else. And he was able to do this task. And they found similar things in other patients with amnesia, that amnesic patients perform as well as controls on a word completion task. So like they'll take a word like house and they'll put a dash in place of some of the letters and you have to try to complete it. And amnesic patients do just fine on this task if they've been told to just guess or use the first word that comes to mind. But if you try to ask them to remember a previously seen list of words, they're going to do terribly. Okay? So what does all this mean? This all means that we have different types of memory that are stored in different places in our brain. Okay? All right, now explicit memory also includes different types of testing. So if you're given a free recall test where you have to just come up with the answer on your own, that's pretty difficult, right? So an example would be, what is the definition of psychology? But if you have a recognition test where you can pick that definition from a list of alternatives, that's easier, right? Recognition is easier than free recall. Why is that true? They think it's because a recognition task contains retrieval cues, which are basically reminders. So seeing that definition will kind of remind you of reading about it previously. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And I think I'm going to try to, actually, I think I'm going to stop here for now and I'll pick back up in another one.